can you keep a secret?
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds. Changing hearts and minds. Changing hearts and minds.
Changing hearts and minds.
Welcome to Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Changing Hearts and Minds, a show about reviving the warrior spirit and remembering the past to improve our future. I'm your host, Jeff Adamec. Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I totally screwed or what? You're funny.
I want to discuss all this behavior.
Let me out of here!
Hey guys, Jeff here. Believe it or not, the rating system on platforms like iTunes do matter. Going to iTunes and rating the show and making comments affects the algorithm iTunes uses to rate and advertise shows. We also use ratings to see what you like, don't like, and comments you guys give us on info on what shows you want to see and what shows you don't want to see. So visit iTunes and search for Change Your POV to make your voice heard. Also, we do not charge to download our standard content. We never have and we never will. We do, however, have costs that do add up. We also give special episodes, content, and bonuses to our Patreon members. So like my princess says at the end of the show, help us help others and join our team. Visit www.patreon.com/changeyourpov or go to changeyourpov.com, click on the Patreon link, and go to Patreon. Donate anything you can. If every listener donated just $1, then we could produce better shows for all of you and increase the content that we can provide. So this is a challenge to all the Changing Hearts and Minds listeners. Let's lead the way for the other network shows by all donating. Even though I put my time and effort and my own money into the show every week, I already started to pledge $20 a month. Follow me and become at least $1 Patreon donor. Let's set the example for other shows, and let's lead by example. Legacy is important. Our past is nothing but a preamble to our future. When my buddy Andrew McDowell, my History Episodes guest host, told me he wanted to do a show on Daniel Boone, I was all for it. I told my family, and my wife then, matter-of-factly, told me, "That's funny, I'm related to Daniel Boone." I was shocked. It became my mission to discover the history of this pioneer of America and founding father, and even more to know that the same DNA that went through Boone's body is the same of my wife and both of my children, my son Trent and my daughter Peyton. Special thanks to Nancy Rudy, my wife's aunt, for keeping this knowledge alive, and I dedicate this, my first two-part episode of Changing Hearts and Minds, to my family. I am proud and fortunate to have you all in my life, and this episode is for our children and their children and their children's children to keep legacy alive.
Hey, dude.
Hey, buddy.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Happy Labor Day.
Happy Labor Day. Happy day that we celebrate the American worker like communists. How you doing, buddy? How's everything?
I'm good.
How's that baby?
Good.
How's that baby doing?
She's loud, man.
Yeah, they'll do that, bro. That's what babies do. They get loud.
It's weird, man. Like, I'm a relatively quiet person, and my wife is like a shrinking violet. I don't know where this comes from.
It's a baby, dude. They're loud like that so that you can hear them when they need you. You know?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It's just the way it is.
I know. But she's good.
She'll
getting big.
quiet out. By the time she's 3 years old, her personality will be set in place, and she'll learn a lot of that personality from you and your wife. So she'll probably be very quiet. That, or she'll do what like a lot of kids do, is they just completely the opposite of what their parents are and drive you guys nuts.
Oh well, that's likely too. My wife and I are both pretty big nerds, as I think you know of me for sure. But I just have.
Well, I knew your wife.
Feeling.
Your wife had to be a nerd because there's no my wife would not let me dress my daughter up like Ray to come home from the hospital if I wanted to. She'll roll her eyes and go with me to the Star Wars movies, but she's not celebrating it in any small way. When I start going on and on about this comic book movie or that Star Wars movie, she just kind of sits there and just looks at me like I married this guy. So it happened. Lewis and Clark, Davy Crockett, James Jim Bowie. These are names associated with the frontier of America. They summon more than just visions of fighting bears and wearing fur raccoon skin hats. They bring up the feeling of adventure and and the bold history of America. And although there is some very dark and bloody history of our great nation, there's also some inspiration and courage that can be found and should be passed on to the generations that come after us. Currently, we're surrounded by our history being torn down around us for various reasons, and I won't argue the reasons behind it or if it's right or wrong. I will say with confidence that washing our country's history away to avoid being offensive is in and of itself offensive and very dangerous, because those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. Now, let me climb down off my soapbox, guys. Let's go ahead today, and we're going to celebrate a figure in American history that can inspire some feelings of adventure and the bold American spirit that we've come to love and come to define us. Today, Changing Hearts and Minds, we'll discuss Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone is far more than just a historic member of the American story. I am related to Daniel, albeit through marriage, and nonetheless, my children are legacy members of the Boone story and actually shared DNA with Daniel Boone, so I can argue that I'm related to him through that way. Squire and Sarah Boone had 11 children. Daniel Boone's older brother, Jonathan Boone, was born 4 years prior to Daniel in 1730. He lived until 1808. Jonathan Boone married Mary Carter Boone, and they had a daughter named Mary Polly Boone. Mary Polly Boone married a man called John Smelser. These two are my wife's great-great-great 4 times grandparents, making Daniel Boone, my son and my daughter's great-great-great-great-great, that's 5 times, uncle. I want to dedicate this show of the history of Uncle Daniel in honor of David Rudy, who sadly has recently passed. Uncle Dave's wife, Aunt Nancy, my wife's aunt, is a source of our knowledge in the family of the relation to Daniel Boone. I want to thank Aunt Nancy for keeping this history alive, and this episode is for the future generations of our family to hear about Uncle Daniel. And I'm only related by marriage, but my children do carry on the DNA, so I'll make sure I do my part to pass the history on to them so our children can be aware of the legacy. Now, let's go right into it and talk about Daniel Boone. Today on the show, I have the man who is actually responsible for coming up with the idea of doing a show on Daniel Boone, our buddy and historical reference guide, Andrew McDowell. Andrew, how you doing, buddy?
I'm good, man. How are you?
How'd you like that intro, huh?
That was killer, man. I mean, nothing I could ever say is going to come close to that.
Well, no, it could, because I literally just, what I did was I pulled up an old episode of the talk show.
Oh, not Montel Williams.
Not Montel Williams, close though. The guy from Cleveland, the white guy.
Jerry Springer.
Jerry Springer. So I pulled up an old Jerry Springer episode, and I just took one of his closing comments that was always like, well, he has all these people, all these rednecks and you know, people fighting with each other, and then he stops and he has this really heartfelt. I just took one of his speeches and just changed names in it to Daniel Boone. No, I'm just kidding.
I didn't know he got that deep.
He did. If you watch his little moments he has at the end of the shows are always real deep, and it's always funny because he's having these real deep moments, and in the back there's some Ku Klux Klan member who had sex with his sister. And, you know, they're in the back right there fighting with some you know, Nation of Islam fundamentalists, and they're throwing chairs in the back, and he's sitting there talking about, you know, follow your heart and be about, you know, it was just always funny to me. So Daniel Boone, November 2nd, 1734. And guys, before we even start, I'm going to make it clear that this was before the Gregorian calendar. So some people say he was born in November. Some people said he was born in October. I like to envision in my head that Daniel Boone probably just utilized both and got 2 birthdays a year.
That sounds about right for his character.
He was considered an American pioneer, an explorer, a woodsman, and a frontiersman. His historic life has made him one of America's first folk heroes. And he also, so that we stay in part with our veteran stuff, he served as a military officer during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, believe it or not. He was actually in the military during that war, even though he didn't fight. The Revolutionary War, as I said, and the French and Indian War. And we are going to go into all that stuff. First of all, let's just go. We're going to jump right in. We've got a lot of information to go on, so we're not going to spend a lot of time just catching up. Everyone wants to catch up with Andrew. They can go on Neophyte in the Woods and check him up there. But let's jump right into the early days of Daniel Boone. I'm going to go ahead and let Andrew just go crazy with all the early years, the information about Daniel Boone that you didn't know that you wish you did. And for those of you who are in my family who are going to be listening to this show, this is why I'm doing this show, guys. So you can sit them kids down. They can stop being ignorant to their history and listen to it. So make them sit down and listen to this story. Andrew, please, the early years of Daniel Boone.
Absolutely. So as Jeff just said, he was born in early November 1734. His kind of extraction was English and Welsh. They came over, you know, in kind of the early colonial period, his family, and settled in here. They actually fled England, if I'm remembering my facts correctly, because they were members of a group called the Religious Society of Friends, who are better known as us, kind of in the United States, as Quakers.
That's the guy. That's the guy from the breakfast cereal, right?
Yes, exactly. It just oats. That's all they believed in, oats.
They made oats. That's all. Oats and pacifism. We don't want to fight. We just want oatmeal.
And I think that's one of the, and this will become readily apparent later on, I think that's one of the interesting things about Daniel Boone is that he grew up in this pacifist, peaceful, kind of pastoral, religious order. But, he raised a little bit of hell, and, he did some cool stuff that was decidedly at odds. I'll touch on this a little bit later, but there's actually some early American and still present day, I don't want to say counter-religious, but secular leanings in his family that might have had an influence on him.
Yeah.
So Quakers, as we are going to call them, because it fits in the mouth a little bit better, were persecuted in English for their dissenting religious and social beliefs. These are really extreme views, like the presence of God in every person, the absence of an official clergy, the spiritual equality of both men and women, and their strong-held belief in pacifism.
Wow, those are some really extreme views. Are you saying that their extreme views were that God exists in every single person, that men and women are equal, and that you should turn the other cheek and not fight when you don't have to?
Yeah,
those extreme views are manic. Thank God England got rid of those people.
Absolutely. I think that the world is a much better place for kicking them out. Let's be clear.
Good Lord. Extreme views. I mean, I'd hate to hear what the normal views were if those were considered extreme.
Well, I mean, we're looking at the early 1700s, so it's still witches and evil spirits. I think that those are mainstream at this point.
So like both ends of the spectrum, like the conservative and liberal views would be like the Puritans or the Quakers.
Yeah.
Fire and brimstone, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Exactly. I think that sets up the spectrum pretty well.
Yeah.
And somewhere in the middle was the Enlightenment going on at the same time. They're probably somewhere in between.
Right.
Just getting back on course a little bit there. Daniel Boone's parents had one really unusual name and one really normal name. Squire was his father, and Sarah was his mother. They settled in Pennsylvania, the Boone family. Daniel grew up in kind of the area around what is now Reading, Pennsylvania. He was almost exactly in the middle of his family. He was the sixth of 11. And he had kind of a normalish childhood for the period. He received his first rifle at the age of 12. And because of the Quakers' good relationship with the local Native American tribes, he learned how to hunt and live off the land at a very young age. And that was directly because of the relationship he had with these local tribes. And this would stand him in good stead when he was, as we'll talk about later, pushing west, really exploring lands that were entirely, controlled by Native Americans. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, now talking about, as we mentioned before, the falling out that his family had with the Quakers. Do you see kind of like maybe some foreshadowing, some early images of that? Because I mean, the Lenape tribe, which was a tribe, the local tribes that he was, his family was friendly with, and that he learned a lot of his living off the land from. He was given a rifle. He was allowed to hunt. Now I don't know for sure, and I don't know if you do or not, but did the Quakers shun hunting? I mean, they had to survive somehow. So I think that showing his parents allowing him to be friendly and, fraternize with the local Indian tribes and learn from them, I think was a little foreshadowing that his family wasn't going to stand up for the religious, towing the religious line later on.
Yep. And not even later on, I don't know about the kind of the Quaker views on hunting. If I had to guess, these guys were living on the frontier. I mean, Pennsylvania was part of the western frontier and southern frontier at this point.
Right.
So I'm going to go ahead and guess that hunting wasn't as unusual.
It wasn't a bad thing, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, how the hell they had to have lived somehow.
Exactly. And it's like, the modern farmer, right? Deer and bear was a really popular meat at the time on the frontier. Hunting bear and hunting deer and hunting, waterfowl and game was just part of life. It's like a farmer, you have cows, and cows are there to give you milk and to give you meat and to give you more cows. So one way or the other, there's going to be a little bit paid involved for every animal. I think one of the things, we mentioned about not towing the religious line, he had the Boone family had a falling out with the Quakers. They actually had several. And they ranged from Squire Boone basically letting his wife have opinions that were outside the usual and speak up a little bit more. Quakers seem to believe in equality, but at the end of the day, women's place was in the home and men's place was out in the world. And Squire Boone didn't really seem to hold to that. The other thing that I'm going to call, I'm 75% sure of based on the reading I've done about him, was that Squire and Daniel were Freemasons. On Squire Boone's grave, there's a Masonic symbol, and obviously, Masons have I'm going to call it an uncomfortable relationship with organized religion at times.
I would say that's understating it, I think.
Yep. I'm trying to, we're up here in the Northeast, so I have to be.
There's no Masons coming after you, buddy.
Okay. They had an actively confrontational approach to religion. That's really what was kind of the inciting incident that had Squire and Sarah and their kids move to the cutting edge of the frontier in the Yadkin Valley in North Carolina, which is, if you haven't been through there, I was just down there last week for the eclipse. Beautiful country. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, even to this day. How wild it is.
Right.
So this is, for those of you who don't know, it's Davies County. It's in the northwest part of North Carolina. Mocksville is the kind of the regional seat, if you will. And that sort of brought us through Boone's early years, where he's born, he grows up, he learns the skills that make him part of who he is, and then some stuff happens between the British and the French.
Right. 1750, following the fallout between Squire Boone and Quakers. And the funny thing is, going back to that, I did read that it got so bad that Squire Boone would not go to services anymore, but yet his wife and the kids would still attend. And so him moving the family in 1750 from Pennsylvania to North Carolina to the Yadkin River Valley was almost necessary, because here's the guy, his wife is still attending church when she's not supposed to have opinions, and he wasn't going to church because of the falling out, because he allowed his kids to marry outside the Quaker religion. But good on him, way to go. And I do not know about the Masonry connection, so I do think that's probably had a lot to do with it also. But 1750 moves to Mocksville, North Carolina, and the Yadkin River Valley, and in 1754 war officially broke out between the French and the British, and each of them had their own Indian tribes that allied themselves with the two separate nations, and this became known as the French and Indian War. The very first and earliest colonial major conflict in history. North Carolina, believe it or not, even though a lot of this fighting in the French and Indian War was done, you always hear about it happening more in like the northwestern portion of the colonies, up there around Canada and everything. But North Carolina actually called up a militia. They participated in the fighting on the British side of the conflict, obviously. Boone volunteered to serve, and under a Captain Hugh Waddell, he served on the Carolina frontier under the overall command of the British General Edward Braddock. And Edward Braddock was actually a good friend with George Washington, probably a little bit of a Masonic connection there too, but as we know, George Washington was a British officer before he was an American officer, even though he was born in the United States. He was good friends with this General Edward Braddock. Boone and his cousin Daniel Morgan, who would later be a general in the American Revolution, a very well-known general as a matter of fact, served as what were called wagoneers, or more common to the phrases of today, teamsters. And no, they didn't drive pickup trucks or load out boxes and strike and have connections to the mob. These teamsters were actually just guys who ran wagon teams of horses. That's where the word teamsters come from, teams of horses. And so he was a wagoner along with Daniel Morgan in General Edward Braddock's militia for North Carolina. This led to what was called the Battle of Monongahela, which is also known as the Battle of Braddock's Field, and or the Battle of the Wilderness, which, these older battles got like 10 different names apiece, depending on who you're talking to. This took place on 9 July 1755. It was at the beginning of the French and Indian War, at what was called Braddock's Field, is now Braddock, Pennsylvania. So it was about 10 miles east of Pittsburgh. The British forces under General Braddock, moving to take what was called Fort Duquesne, was defeated by, and I probably butchered that word, so please.
I was going to say, these are hard names.
Yeah, these are hard names. It's French. I speak French, but still, I can't say that word. He was defeated by a force of French and Canadian troops under Captain Daniel del Boone with its American Indian allies. The defeat marked the end of the Braddock expedition, so you can pretty much understand what happened to Braddock's forces if it ended his expedition, by which the British had hopes of capturing Fort Dieskau and gaining control of the strategic Ohio County. Braddock was mortally wounded in the battle and died during the retreat near present-day Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and Boone just narrowly escaped death in this battle. The defeat was later attributed to the arrogance and bad decision-making of General Braddock, and for the rest of his life, Boone was critical of Braddock's command. His leadership in his command, Boone was openly critical about Braddock's stuff, and even though Braddock had, connections with guys like General Washington and everything, Boone just wasn't having it. He would definitely call the guy out for the mistakes he made. So, following this loss and his, in the Battle of Braddock's Field, he returned home from the French and Indian War in August of 1756. Boone then married Rebecca Bryan, who was a family neighbor from the Yadkin Valley and whose brother had recently married one of Boone's sisters. There's a lot of cool stories about how he met her. He met her back when she was like 12 years old. He was a little bit older, but the stories go that he did wait until she was older before he courted her openly. But there is a cool story of him meeting her at a family picnic. There was a local picnic, and he's sitting down and talking with her, and he's got his knife out and he's playing around with his knife. And the story goes is that at one point they look down and find that her apron that was laid out had 4 holes in it from his knife, and his knife was stuck through her apron. And he would tell this story to his family and his kids would joke around. They'd be like, "Wow, Dad, you really smooth move, good way of picking up Mom." Daniel Boone's reaction to that would be like, I was doing it on purpose to see if she had the patience to deal with me and be my wife, which I think is a brilliant move. I'm going to completely destroy your, because guys, there was no Walmart and there was no, local mall just to go get clothes at. People made their own clothes. And here's Daniel Boone destroying his would-be girlfriend's apron just to see if she's patient enough to deal with him. Apparently she was patient enough to deal with him because he did marry her. Talking about his family life, his father's allowance, and it's funny, my wife's name is Sarah. Daniel Boone's mother's name is Sarah. His mother's name is Sarah with an H. Mine is Sarah without an H. And although I'm pretty sure there is no connection, I'm going to go ahead and say the namesake came from that, just because it sounds cool. But officially, it didn't. But Sarah, my wife, is completely over. She's outspoken. She does what she wants to do, and I just kind of, I just provide the home. She runs it, and I think that this translated to Daniel Boone because his wife was a very independent and strong person. Rebecca kind of was in charge of things, and I think that was something that came from his experiences seeing the way his father Squire and his mother Sarah interacted. Mm-hmm. So he comes back after the war, gets married, he's living it up, and then we're going to go jump forward to 1754, and we're going to talk about probably the stuff about Daniel Boone that gets Andrew interested in. And let's talk about his history as a hunter and trapper. And Andrew, you go ahead and take us through that information.
Sure. So at the time, there wasn't, there's no polypro. There was nothing really artificial. Everything came from the earth in terms of what you wore. So you either wore leather from cows or pigs, or you wore fur or hide that came from deer or bison or elk or bear. So there was a prosperous fur trade going on, and Daniel Boone got in on this. He ended up supporting his family to a greater or lesser extent, as we'll see later on, by being a hunter and trapper. He'd go out and collect pelts. Interestingly enough, the hunting seasons weren't what they are today. Now you go out, you hunt deer in, September, October, November, December, January. The height of the deer hunting season for the fur trade was actually in the summer. And in the winter, you trapped. You kind of flipped it around a little bit, although you trap more in the winter now too. He would go out for weeks and months at a time on what were called long hunts, which were extended expeditions into the wilderness. They'd last weeks, months. At one point, Daniel Boone is gone for I think a year plus, hunting and collecting pelts. And this is where his fame really started. Most of the frontiermen during this time carved messages into trees, wrote their names on cave walls, and some of these are still present. If you go to Washington County, Tennessee, you can see an engraving that's inscribed, D. Boone killed a bar on this tree in the year 1760. And I paused there because the spelling, Daniel Boone was literate. I mean, he could write and he could read, more or less. What he couldn't do, and what nobody really could do at the time, was engage in standardized spelling. So that sentence that I just read to you, carved on the tree, so killed is spelled Cilled, bear is spelled bar, Bar, like the place you go to drink, and then everything else is more or less correctly spelled, which is just cool. And you see that throughout kind of the frontier of the 1700s. It's kind of a way of saying, I've been here, I've done that. And it was a way of getting messages across by signing and dating it. If another trapper came this way and found it and they went back home, they could tell your family, well, I knew he was still alive in July of 1760, but, I don't know anything past that. So it's kind of
the thing that sucks about stuff like that, and like what you discussed, was there's been notably historic rumors of Daniel Boone's illiteracy.
Yep.
And I want to contradict it openly, as a lot of historians do, because he was able to phonetically spell writing on trees, and he did have a limited education, because he spent a lot more of his time learning from the Indian tribes on how to survive in the wilderness, rather than going to school. And you can find books on his father argued that his job is not to learn how to read and write. His job is to learn how to provide for his family. He was well known to read to his partners on these trips.
Yep.
He always had a copy of the Bible, and always his favorite book was Gulliver's Travels. And he was best known to read to his companions during these hunting expeditions. So this unfounded, well, not unfounded, because I could see where they get it from, but this inaccurate rumor that Daniel Boone was illiterate, I think it's a poorly placed idea, because our founding fathers, these guys who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence and everything, these guys were highly educated, and even they, at times, when you read some things, don't spell it exactly the way we would spell it nowadays. The fact that he was phonetically able to negotiate writing these things, and who's to say that Daniel Boone carved these things? He could have been on a trip with these other guys, and one of the other dudes grabbed a knife and, hey, this is where Daniel killed that bear, so he's carving it in, and hey, Daniel, because if you look, there's the two examples that I found was the one you read that's in Washington County. D. Boone killed Cilled, a bar on a tree, 1760. But at the Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky, there's also another one that says D. Boone kilt, Kilt, a bar, Bar, 1803. So there are two separate ways of spelling the same word, and to me that either indicates one of two things. Either one of them is a fraud. Daniel Boone just went back and forth between spelling it incorrectly, or somebody other than Daniel Boone actually carved it in the tree that was with him and just used their phonetic way of spelling it when they did that. So I want to put
I just want to jump in right here, and that's the other thing that I've noticed in my reading about Boone is that he spelled his name consistently, Boone, all the time, which leads me to think that those two examples might not be him, or he might have been carving him.
Right, because his name is spelled Boon on both of those. So, yeah, I want to I think we could put it to bed. I think that Daniel Boone was literate as he needed to be. Obviously, was not an unintelligent guy. He was very intelligent, and so, rumors of illiteracy, I think, are unfounded.
I agree. I think that's we can take that one as a given for purposes of our conversation.
Great.
So he's out there in the 1750s exploring and hunting. In 1758, the British and Cherokee nation engaged in an armed conflict. Not going to call it a war. It was more of a insurrection or an uprising. They call it the Cherokee uprising.
The Cherokee were actually their allies during the French and Indian War, weren't they?
That's correct. And during this period, Boone served as an officer in the North Carolina militia. The Boone family, along with many others during this period, moved to the Culpeper Valley in Virginia to be a little bit further away from the fighting. But during this period, Boone served away from his family and went on expeditions deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains. After the hostilities I don't want to say ceased, because there continued to be raids and skirmishes with the native tribes in the area for years and years to come. But in the early 1760s, the family moved back to the Yadkin Valley from the Culpeper, and then eventually I'm going to call it an uneasy peace was made with the Cherokee. That was in the mid 1760s. This is where we start to see kind of a recurring theme in Daniel Boone's life. That one of those themes is debt. He repeatedly struggled to stay out of debt throughout his entire life, but it really kind of emerged right now in the period following the uprising. And he had to sell off a lot of the land that he had been awarded or had purchased, or his father had purchased. And this debt isn't because he was a bad businessman, although he kind of was. Financing these expeditions was phenomenally expensive. You had to buy horses, you had to buy food, you had to buy guns, you had to buy ammo. So he ended up buying a lot. He and his partners ended up buying a lot of the stuff on credit. And what would happen is you'd go out with all your stuff, you'd kill a lot of deer, you'd prepare the hides, and then you'd cache them because you couldn't carry them all with you.
And cache them is C-A-C-H-E?
Yes.
Cash is in hiding something for later, not cash, C-A-S-H. As money is referred to. I just want to make sure for the younger people out there who are going to be listening to this episode, especially for my family, to cache something as in to store it for later, rather than to cache something as in to turn it in for money.
Yep, exactly. Thank you for making that distinction. And what would often happen to these caches is either Boone would go and get them, and then native warriors would steal them from him at gunpoint, or they would find them and steal the caches, while he was out gathering more hides, or other trappers or hunters would come and just mag them from him. He'd have to basically go back to, the Yadkin, to his creditors, and say, just spent a year of my life and everything was stolen. So sorry, can we try this again? And that was kind of a ongoing problem for Boone. To his credit, he always did his best to pay off his debtors, but it was kind of a continuing issue for him.
Right.
So we're in the mid 1860s now, and in the
1760s. I mean,
70s,
you want to jump 100 years in the future? That's great, but I don't think time travel worked back then.
I wish it worked now, man. I'd go back by Google, and I'd be retired. It would be great.
Oh yeah, it'd be awesome.
So in the 1760s, 1765, Squire Boone, Daniel Boone's father, died, and here's where the naming gets a little bit confusing. Daniel Boone also had a brother named Squire. So from this point on, when we're talking about Squire Boone, we're talking about his brother. What ended up happening after Daniel's father died was he and his brother and a group of men traveled south to Florida with the hope of locating hunting grounds. This is widely regarded to be fruitless, and according to Boone family stories, he bought land in Florida to move his family. But his wife refused to move so far away from kind of kith and kin and hearth and home that she didn't want to move to Florida. I don't blame her. I don't want to move to Florida.
Wait a minute. Andrew, you're Jewish, right?
Yes.
Isn't Florida where Jewish people go to retire?
It's where they go to die.
Oh,
I'm not ready to die yet.
Okay, noted.
My wife is Italian, and she just wants nothing to do with it. So, I guess we're going to have to settle in North Carolina one day.
It's not bad down here. I like it.
Yeah, I know, I do too. One day, once I win Powerball, we'll move ourselves down there. So Boone needed to get away from kind of where he was at and his creditors.
He needed to get away from his creditors.
And let's be honest, that was part of the reason why he moved.
Yeah, no, understood.
So he moved again outside the Yadkin, even more to the frontier. I mean, he's if you think about the frontier in like gradients, like he was at 50% frontier in the Yadkin, he's at like 90% frontier now. Like it's woods and Native Americans and hunters and trappers. And this was so at this point is when he really starts to go on really long hunting trips out into the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this is an area that his military service during the Cherokee uprising had made him intimately familiar with. And this is another kind of ongoing theme with Boone. He's always pushing the frontier. He's always got some wanderlust and wants to see what's out there.
Right.
To the point where in 1767, he goes further west than some sources would indicate any other white man has ever been. he actually goes to Kentucky. He shoots the Cumberland Gap with his brother Squire Boone Jr. and hits this kind of fertile, untouched hunting ground. And he comes back. He recruits some, and he's been interested in this land since he was in Braddock's army. A frontiersman and merchant named John Findlay had told him about this and told him about the Cumberland Gap and told him that it was out there. And Boone kind of takes this story to heart and keeps and goes looking for it and wants to explore.
Yeah, at the time, Kentucky was considered to be like a promised land almost.
Yep.
You know, the land of fruit and honey, and you know, it was. It's still beautiful land out there in Kentucky nowadays. But can you imagine the untouched land that was Kentucky, just on the other side of those mountains, and for guys like Boone and Findlay and a lot of these other frontiersmen, Dean Morgan and all of it, this thing was just beautiful for them, and it was kind of like it was the place to go. I mean, as you're going to see as we go into this even more, Kentucky became like the place to be if you wanted to have anything to do with, you know, Tennessee and Kentucky. That area was just it was almost mythical to these guys.
It was. I think the natives called it the Great Meadow. I mean, it was perfect hunting ground.
And that's what I think Kentucky, which is the way the Indians pronounced it. Its direct definition, as it equates, is, you know, great open meadow or great meadow, something along those lines.
Yep, exactly. So Boone starts pushing the frontier. In May of 1769, he begins a 2-year-long expedition to Kentucky, or what he was planning on being a 2-year-long expedition to Kentucky. However, in December of that year, Boone and a couple of his fellow hunters were actually captured by a party of Shawnee who took all of his skins, told them never to return, and basically kicked him out and said, "Get out of here, don't come back, and we'll kill you."
Yeah, kind of strong-armed him.
Yep. Boone was not a man to have people tell him what to do.
That's one way of putting it. I would say he was just hard-headed and stubborn.
That's another way to put it. And he came back. He came back again and again and again. In 1773, on the 5th of July, Boone, his family, and 50 others made the first concerted attempt by British colonists to actually settle in Kentucky. The group was led by a man named William Russell, who was a well-known Virginian and relatively wealthy. And the group was led by Russell because Boone was not moneyed and was, at the time at least, a relatively, you know, he wasn't a nationally known hunter. He was regionally known as a great marksman and hunter, but he didn't have the cachet necessarily to bring 50 plus people together and, you know, take him out into the frontier.
Right. So I always equate this to William Russell was the money and the name behind it. He was the official leader. The unofficial leader, the shadow governor of the expedition, was probably Boone. Because Boone did lead them through the Cumberland Pass into Kentucky, and without Boone, they would have not made it that far. However, like you said, the funds and the money behind the entire expedition was Russell. So therefore, he had to, you know, he goes down in history as being the leader. And also, William Russell and Boone, when you hear stories about this expedition, these two were always together. So I think it was like a combined effort between the two of them.
Yes. Yeah, I think that it's kind of like the difference between like strategic and operational.
Right.
Boone definitely had the operational and tactical command of this, and Russell kind of pointed the general direction and said, "Figure it out."
Right.
This whole kind of trip to the frontier wasn't without some setbacks and heartache for the Boones. On October 9th of the year they set out, Boone's oldest son, James, and a small group of men and boys left the party to collect supplies, and they were attacked by a combined band of Delaware, Shawnee, and Cherokees. James Boone, William Boone's son, and Henry Russell, William Russell's son, were tortured and killed by this band of Indians.
Brutally tortured and killed.
I mean,
it would be the equivalent of a modern day beheading by terrorists.
Yep.
On a video sent back to the families. That's how it reads historic.
And prior to that, they were shot with arrows and, you know, had some of the skins flinched from their bones. I mean, it was torture, you know, no doubt about it. And this is actually something that tortured Boone later on. They found the bodies of the guys who were killed, tortured and killed by this band, and they put them in a relatively shallow grave, just because they had to keep moving and they didn't know if the band was still in the area. Later on, after they get settled, Boone actually comes back and digs a more appropriate grave from his son for his son and Russell's son. But this is not before they realize that they're in over their heads. So they abandoned the settlement that they were planning to make in Kentucky. It was the first. This murder and torture was one of the kind of inciting incidents or first acts of what came to be called Lord Dunsmore's War. It was a conflict between Virginia, headed up, I think Governor Dunmore was the colonial governor at the time, and the Shawnees. Boone, as always, had to be at the center of everything, or found himself in the center of everything. So Boone served again in the militia and helped defend the settlers along the Clinch River in what is now West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. During this time, he was promoted to captain of the colonial militia. So he's definitely starting to climb the ranks from wagon tender to commanding officer at this point.
Yeah, this is a big promotion for the time period because, as we know, many times in the colonial times, whether or not you were an officer in the militia pretty much determined your family's state in the world. Whether or not you were wealthy. Many times, whether or not you owned a horse had a lot to do with whether or not you were made an officer or not. But he came up from being what would be considered a private in the militia, all the way to being a captain. And this was a very, very big deal for the time period for someone who was considered although well known as a trapper and hunter, he was not well known for his money. I mean, like you said, he was in debt, and being in debt back then was a kiss of death for a lot of guys. It was something that really would follow people around for a long time and be a shameful experience for their family. So him making the point to being promoted to captain was a very, very big deal.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, he went from being what I think the British aristocrats would call a rustic to something that they would call a gentleman. Is a not a bad vertical leap for a guy from the frontier. So it kind of speaks to his character and ability.
Well, there you go, guys. There's part 1 of the history of Daniel Boone, as told by me, Jeff Adamec, and Andrew McDowell. Guys, next week you want to join us because things are just starting to get heated up for Daniel and his story, his historic story, the tragic loss of his son and his friend's son to the Shawnee in Kentucky will and be the catalyst and motivation for the act that pretty much solidifies Daniel Boone in the history of the United States as being one of the greatest pioneers that we've ever known. Not just that, but his heroic actions, defense of his namesake fort in Kentucky, his being captured and adopted by the Indian tribes, his escape and subsequent battles and subsequent fighting that he did on the side of the Americans are all going to be next week on part 2 of the history of Daniel Boone.
Change your POV and all of its shows can help and heal and even educate. We want you to help us help others. Visit our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/changeyourpov. Become a patron of our network and our mission.